Hey, this is Miss D, and in this video I'm going to give you a really fast overview of post-colonial independence. All right, some of the people that you're going to see mentioned on the Regents that oftentimes they'll give you like 2 or 3 names, and they'll say, what do these guys all have in common? They're all nationalist leaders. These were the people who, in this era, these are where countries that had formerly been colonies and formerly been under the occupation of European forces. Um, uh, there's a rise of nationalism, and these areas all across the world gain independence. One of the key figures, of course, is Mohandas Gandhi from India, and we're going to talk about him in detail because he's a really key figure to know. Not only will he come up on multiple choice questions, but frequently he is a topic that comes up on thematic essays, and DBQ essays. So make sure you know about him. Next is Kwame Nkrumah. He is another leader in Ghana. He is going to fight against British occupation there. Jomo Kenyatta, the Mau Mau movement. He's in Kenya, another nationalist leader. Nelson Mandela of South Africa. South Africa is a little different than some of the other countries, and they had a very kind of much more specific kind of different experience. But we're going to go into detail with him later because, again, like Gandhi, Mandela is often a topic that's used on thematic essays, so you're going to need to know a bit more about him. And then Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh comes up a little bit on the Global Regents, but to be honest, the Vietnam War is a topic that's handled much more in depth on the U.S. Regents. And although he does come up as a potential thematic essay topic, I think it's easier to just know Gandhi and Mandela are the ones that most of my students are most familiar with. So usually I just focus on them as opposed to him. All right, so we're going to start this topic by focusing on the experience of India and India's independence movement. If you get a question on this, usually it'll be a question on, there's been essays on the topic of imperialism generally, or like I said, influential leaders or something like that. And if you are writing a topic about about Gandhi, 99.9% of the time, the essay topic is going to ask something about, please explain the historical circumstances that brought this nationalist leader to power, or something to that effect. And so when you start a discussion of Gandhi, you're going to want to talk about the background, you're going to want to talk about the history, and really you can get into, if you can't recall offhand, please be sure to refresh yourself and take a look at the imperialism video. And you're going to want to look at the experience of India as under occupation by the British, and it was a victim of British imperialism. And so if you remember from imperialism, why do countries get imperialized? And the big economic reasons are you want a country that's going to provide you with raw materials, you're going to want to use them as a market, so on and so forth. So all that discussion about the British and India under imperialism, you're going to want to use. What happens is for a long time, the Indians under British occupation, with the British Raj, for the most part, things were kind of going along okay. But the first real significant bump in the road, or at least the one that the Regents kind of focuses on, is the Sepoy Rebellion. Again, we talked about it earlier, but just to refresh your memory, the Sepoy Rebellion was, well, first, to understand the Sepoy Rebellion, you got to remember what a sepoy is. A sepoy is the name of an Indian soldier who served in the British Army in India. And these soldiers, these sepoy soldiers, included a number of different religious groups, including Hindus and Muslims. All right, so Hindus and Muslims normally don't get along, but within the Sepoy, they did okay. They were able to function. Anyway, the Sepoy Rebellion starts because there is word the Sepoy end up getting a new kind of gun, and this gun has a different type of bullet cartridge. And the idea with the bullet cartridge is that the soldier is to take the cartridge, rip off the end of the cartridge, shove the cartridge into the gun, and then fire. And to get the cartridge into the gun, obviously the cartridge must be lubricated. And there's grease, so there's grease added to the cartridge, and word spreads among the sepoy that the grease used on the cartridge was made from pig and cow fat. Now, I should preface this by saying that, there are reports from the British, they say that's not true, that this was, all a lie, what have you. To a certain extent, or at least for our purposes, it doesn't even matter if it's true or not. What is important to know is that the sepoy certainly believed it was true. And that's what sets events into motion. Because by using pig and cow fat, that offends both Hindus, who hold the cow sacred, and Muslims, who are forbidden from eating pork. So once they put that cartridge into their mouth, they're violating their religions. So even though Hindus and Muslims do not get along, this event, their kind of mutual hatred for the British, actually brings them together. So for this short period, these two groups that normally don't get along are united to fight off the British. Anyway, the Sepoy Rebellion goes on for a while. It's going to fail. Had weak leadership, so on and so forth. But suffice to say, it does last for quite some time. But it does ultimately fail. What the effect of this is some people in India, a lot of people refer to this as the first fight for Indian independence, that this was kind of the first battle of Indian independence. Because it's really after this battle that you start to see a rise in Indian nationalism. Again, quick review. What does nationalism mean? Nationalism is that love for your country, love for your nation. And when you feel that love, what do you want? You want self-rule. When you feel nationalism, feel that love, you want self-rule. And that's what we start to see in India. And so two nationalist organizations are formed. One is the Indian National Congress, that is the Hindu organization, and the other is the Muslim League. Obviously, from the name, it's filled with followers of Islam, Muslims. And so even in the formation of these two groups, you can see how these are two different people who are unwilling to work together to fight off the British, that there's still a lot of divisions within society. And if you remember, one of the strategies of imperialism is something that's known as divide and rule. If you can get the people to fight each other, they're not going to unify to fight the imperialists. All right, so as I said, this is going to start the rise of Indian nationalism, comes after the Sepoy Rebellion. Things keep ticking along. The next key event for purposes of the Regents is the Amritsar Massacre. If you had a chance to see the Gandhi movie or some clips for it, there's a really powerful clip in that movie to kind of give you an idea of what happened. But I mean, it's not 100% historically accurate, but it gives you, a kind of general idea. What happens with the Amritsar Massacre is there's a group of religious pilgrims, make a trip to Amritsar. There was a law, you weren't allowed to meet. There was a meeting held at Amritsar, whether it's because people were ignorant of the law or purposely broke it, I'm not going to say, but there was a meeting held in Amritsar, and some British soldiers went into this square and started firing on the people, the unarmed Indians who were in this meeting, men, women, children, the whole nine. So this massacre again leads to even a further rise of Indian nationalism. For example, you can just look at Gandhi. If you've seen old pictures of Gandhi when he was much younger, oftentimes you'll see there's a lot of pictures floating around on the internet where you'll see Gandhi wearing a suit and dressed because he was a lawyer. And he was very proud of being a British citizen. He attended British schools. He earned a law degree. He was a good British citizen who happened to be of Indian descent. And so even when he was involved in the Indian National Congress, at first, he wanted a larger voice for Indian people, but he didn't necessarily need or look to pursue full independence. But for Gandhi and for many other Indians, after this Amritsar massacre, this is a real breaking point for a lot of Indian people, where they recognize, or they kind of view Britain as the fact that the British will never give them, the respect. The British can't be trusted. The fact that they were capable of this kind of atrocity just really, again, kind of breaks that bond between the people of India and the British. So it's following this event that we start to see Gandhi take on this role as like a very key figure in Indian nationalism and the move towards Indian independence. Gandhi ends up becoming the leader of the Indian National Congress. Okay, with this, I'm going to flip to a different slide, and we're just going to really focus in on Gandhi. All right, so here you go. Taking a look at Gandhi, the key thing he's known for is his approach to fighting for independence. And that was, of course, the use of nonviolence and specifically civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, if you're familiar with that term, what that specifically means, civil disobedience means, again, look at the word disobedience, coming from, sounds like disobey, right? And that's the idea that if there is a law that is unjust and a law you don't agree with, that you will disobey that law purposefully, publicly, as in an effort to kind of show how wrong it is. Okay, that the big example of that is, of course, the Salt March, where Gandhi marches thousands of miles across India with the sole purpose of going to the sea and making salt, even though that was illegal. That's an act of civil disobedience. He is purposefully breaking the law in a very public way, knowing that he's going to get arrested. It's not like, normally when you break a law, you don't want to get caught. If I'm going to go steal somebody's wallet, I don't want everybody to know about it. But that's very different than when you engage in civil disobedience, that you are doing something very, very public with the sole purpose of getting caught, of making it public. In this country, one of the key figures, historical figures that Gandhi inspires is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement in this country, right? So you can think of Rosa Parks, where Rosa Parks sits on the bus, and is a black woman who sits on the bus, and she doesn't give up her seat to a white person, knowing that she's going to get arrested. And that was, again, that's another form of civil disobedience, just that purposefully breaking the law. All right. And again, so of course he influences Martin Luther King Jr. with his approach with nonviolence and civil disobedience. Another person he inspires is Kwame Nkrumah. I'm sure you remember that from the earlier slide, that he is a leader for independence in Ghana. So if you mention him as if you're writing an essay about Gandhi and you talk about his effects, if you put that in, that'll of course be a really important detail. All right, so in addition to nonviolence and civil disobedience, another form of nonviolence, another form of nonviolence isn't just civil disobedience. Another form of nonviolent protest is the boycott. Boycott is where you purposefully don't buy goods. It's kind of an effort to, hurt the person, economically. And if you remember earlier, we talked about the fact that the British imperialized India specifically because India was a great market for British manufactured goods. And one of Britain's most important manufactured goods was cloth, was textiles. If you don't remember all that, if you look at the slide deck on the Industrial Revolution, you should remember that Britain had a lot of textile mills. So being able to sell that cloth to India was really important to the people at home in England. And so Gandhi tells all of the Indian people, do not buy British cloth. Instead, you can do what Gandhi did, and he spun his own. That was called the homespun movement, that he literally created his own cloth. And in addition, as I was saying earlier, when you look at pictures of younger Gandhi, he was dressed as a lawyer, this kind of traditional Western lawyer with the whole Western suit on. And then later in his life, he gets away from that look that looks very kind of stereotypical European and starts dressing in more traditional Indian clothing. And that was all about this kind of rejection of British culture. Again, that rise of nationalism, that love for your own nation, love for your own people, and love for your own culture. That was also really important to him. I talked a little bit about the Salt March, that the British had taxed salt. They wanted to make money on salt, so they made it illegal for Indian people to make their own salt. And you have to remember, India is a peninsula. I mean, it sticks out right into the Indian Ocean. I mean, salt is straight up free. And meanwhile, you're telling the people, nope, can't get salt for free out of the ocean. You got to buy it from us. And so this is just an obscene law. I mean, think about it. Salt isn't, look, I'm Italian, right? So if I had to get by without basil, I would be miserable. I would be really miserable if I couldn't use basil or onion powder in my cooking. I'd be bummed out. But I'm not going to drop dead or anything. I can get by. Salt is a little different, though. You got to remember, salt is an important nutrient. And especially if you're in a hot climate like India and you don't necessarily have refrigeration, having access to salt so that you can preserve food is absolutely critical. So this was, the tax was just really offensive in a lot of different ways. I will tell you, though, just FYI, the Salt March is not successful in getting rid of the tax. Just FYI. The tax actually doesn't go away until after India achieves independence and Nehru becomes the first prime minister of India. So just FYI. The salt tax is successful, however, in raising Gandhi's public profile and raising international awareness of the Indian nationalism movement. That it is successful. That's the reason why it's such an important event, because it raises Gandhi's profile, it raises the profile of what was going on in India, makes the world aware of it. It makes big news, the salt protest. But it does not get rid of the salt tax, oddly enough. All right, and the last thing, another thing I want to talk about, though, is the idea that Gandhi really strongly believes in Hindu-Muslim unity, that he wants both groups to work together, and that was one of the key reasons why he's able to be successful. And again, it's kind of a throwback to what we were saying earlier about the Sepoy Rebellion, is you get these two groups of people who are normally enemies, you get them to work together, it becomes a very powerful force to change India. All right. Unfortunately, although Gandhi is able to keep these two groups together, it's a very uneasy peace. And right after, once India gains independence, there's going to be a partition. And it's going to end up, you're going to have India partitioned into, India is going to remain for the Hindus, but then they're going to create the new country of Pakistan. There's going to be East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And that is the area where there's majority Muslims, and that will be a separate country. So the country is going to be partitioned. There's going to be a partition that the Muslims will move to Pakistan, Hindus will stay in India. And there is a significant amount of violence that accompanies that partition. In fact, it requires, Gandhi ends up going on fasts to try to get the violence down. It was really, really severe, very, very brutal. Millions of people died. And part of the reason they died is because when the British gave India independence, they took off, 1, 2, 3. And, the security forces and all that. And so India just wasn't in a position to basically be able to manage this partition well, and just allowed for kind of local, real violence on both sides. All right, and as you can see, very shortly after, Gandhi himself is a victim of this Hindu-Muslim hatred. He's actually assassinated by a Hindu who felt that Gandhi was too sympathetic to the Muslims, because again, Gandhi himself was a Hindu. The final thing that he's known for is rejecting the caste system. Gandhi felt very strongly that all Indian people should be treated with respect. He wanted to get rid of untouchability, that kind of low caste, and he wanted to see more equality among Indian people. Okay, oops, sorry, got it wrong way. All right, so as you can see, Gandhi leads protests. We went through that. As I mentioned, India is going to achieve independence. There will be a partition, And then you could see massive riots, 1 million people die, and over 14 million people are displaced, are going to be without homes. All right, so what comes after, if I just bring kind of India to present day, just bear in mind, India is going to be known to be non-aligned in the Cold War. They do not take sides. They're going to be neutral. You should remember that, what that means from the Cold War slides. India today is the world's largest democracy. Again, the caste system is illegal today, but I mean, just look at America. I mean, it's illegal to be, discrimination is illegal, sexism is illegal, but, does it still happen? Sure. So, in India, I'm sure it's much better than it was, but yeah, there's areas of the country that, for sure, you're going to see some discrimination among castes, but it is much better. It is illegal. The big thing you should know is the relationship between India and Pakistan. First thing, just FYI, East Pakistan ends up having a civil war with West Pakistan, ends up gaining independence, and today that area is known as Bangladesh. So that is the country of Bangladesh. But West Pakistan and India, there is a significant amount of hatred, tension between these two groups. They do not get along. The people of Pakistan, there's a lot of kind of radical Muslim, kind of radical fundamentalist Muslim kind of, terrorist types in Pakistan that have launched a number of attacks in India. There was one in Mumbai where a lot of people were killed. It's just terrible. That border between India and Pakistan is kind of recognized as one of the most dangerous borders in the world. It's an area where, if we had to say, where in the world could there be a World War III, that's certainly one of the hot spots where it could happen. And what makes that even more dangerous is the fact that both India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. And the fact that these two groups do not get along, as I say here, there's wars over Kashmir. Kashmir is an area of land in India. It's part of India, but the population is majority Muslim. So, and Kashmir includes a lot of water resources. Anyway, you don't need to know that level of detail. But just to let you know, Kashmir is an area where both India and Pakistan want that area, and it's an area that they're all fighting over, and so there's a great deal of tension between the two. And like I said, the fact that both countries also have nuclear weapons just makes it even more dangerous. Okay. Now I'm just going to go over Nelson Mandela real quick. Again, we're talking about the country of South Africa. Again, if you look at the imperialism slides, I did a little bit of coverage over South Africa. Remember, South Africa has been a British colony for a significant period of time. That was way back, even there were the Boer Wars, where there were Dutch settlers that fought the Dutch, Boers, the British, and the Zulu actually had fought for control of that area. Long story short, the Zulu ended up moving on. The Boers lost the Boer War, and so it became a British colony from very, very early on. And then once it was a British colony, what you see is that these the foreigners, the British people, end up kind of setting up the system known as apartheid to keep the native, to keep the indigenous people of South Africa, right, the black South Africans, to keep them subservient, to keep them in a lower class than the whites. Than these white imperialists, these white, settlers. And there's apartheid in the country. This apartheid literally means like segregation. It means that, white and blacks are separate. So that means, there's white schools and black schools. There's white hospitals and black hospitals. There's white beaches and black beaches. I mean, so on and so forth. It's a completely divided society. And naturally, just like our own experience in this country, if you look at, let's say, a black school versus a white school, the white school will have much more money, much higher quality education, so on and so forth. The black school will not have the same financing, will just be a lower quality education, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very unfair. Again, as you can see from the top, black people of South Africa cannot vote. They live in different neighborhoods. The white South Africans have a huge amount of the wealth and property. They just dominate. Even though they're a very tiny percent of the population, they hold the vast majority, vast majority of South Africa's wealth. There's no free press. There was censorship. So even the truth of what was going on in South Africa was not shared in the media. So Nelson Mandela becomes one of the leading figures in the African National Congress. And the African National Congress is, again, another group kind of studying with a nationalist organization, specifically for Black South Africans to gain more rights and to stop apartheid, all right, to end apartheid and to fight for the rights of Black South Africans. What happens is if you say, things that happen kind of before the historic context, like I said, all those things that I discussed about the British in South Africa and all those experiences, that all kind of leads into this. The Sharpsville Massacre is an event, just really briefly, there was something known as a pass law. When you think of a pass law, you can think of it like a passport, right? You know how if you want to travel to another country, you have to show your passport? Well, the idea with the pass law is that if you wanted to travel to a particular neighborhood, if a Black person wanted to travel into, let's say, a white neighborhood in South Africa, there was a law passed that they had to show a pass, that they had to have paperwork to travel inside their own country. So naturally, Black South Africans said, hey, this is a way to control us, to keep us out of white neighborhoods, to further segregate us. And so there was a demonstration in Sharpsville over this. And the reaction of the white South African government was to fire upon the people. And that's why they call it the Sharpsville Massacre. A few people were killed. Actually, a significant number of people were killed. Exact numbers are always going to be tough because, because of the censorship and the fact that there wasn't a free flow of information. Anyway, it's after this that, unlike, at first, the African National Congress and Mandela kind of approached and, took on this kind of, they took on a kind of nonviolence approach. But after the Sharpsville Massacre, Mandela's views kind of changed. And he says, listen, this isn't going to work with these groups. I mean, a big reason why this nonviolent approach worked with Gandhi was it kind of brought shame on the British it kind of shamed the British, across a worldwide audience. But in South Africa, especially with the control of the media and racism, it just didn't have the same impact. So that's why Mandela said, look, we're going to need to kind of, and people are dying. I mean, we're getting shot at. And that's where his views kind of change. And he uses more violence and that to acts of sabotage and things like that to fight against the system of apartheid. And basically, Mandela at that point is considered a terrorist. Even the U.S. views him as a terrorist. And he is going to be arrested and sentenced for life in prison. Around this time, too, is the Soweto Uprising. Soweto Uprising was a student uprising. So this is young students in South African schools who were forced to learn this language, and they considered it the white oppressor's language, long story short. But it was like Afrikaner, I think is how you say it. But so as part of that, all these young students, they're, like middle school, high school, in that kind of neighborhood, these young kids come up, they start protesting, they're kind of going through the streets, completely nonviolent. Lo and behold, what happens? Again, the police shoot these children. And I don't know if you can see it, it's a very, very tiny picture, but that's like a famous picture with this one student kind of holding the body of a dead child. And this is one of the student protesters who was shot. And again, so it's things like this that, again, help turn public opinion against South Africa. The real key reason, one of the big reasons why, or at least one of the big things that's really credited at helping turn the tide and getting South Africa to end its policy of apartheid, is really the boycotts. The fact that, they just hit South Africa really, really hard. It internationally, just all the different countries of the world finally stopped. I mean, they had apartheid until the 1990s. That's insane. I mean, we ended at the 1950s, which was shameful enough. 1950s, 1960s. It's shameful that it lasted that long. But 1990s, I mean, come on, that's crazy. I guess to you teenagers who were born in, in the 2000s, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But for somebody like me, I was born in 1970. This is insane that it lasted that long. Again, this boycott of South African goods that people started to divest. They wouldn't have investments and things like that. It just took a huge economic toll on the country of South Africa. And lo and behold, Mandela is let out of prison, and he works with the last white South African president of South Africa. So F.W. de Klerk. F.W. de Klerk is the last president elected under apartheid. But Mandela and de Klerk work together. They end apartheid. An election is held, and Mandela wins as president. So if you're looking at kind of the effects or some policies that Mandela put into play, first of all, one of the key effects of this fight for independence is it was really achieved relatively bloodlessly. There wasn't like a huge civil war. I mean, if you compare and contrast the experience in, let's say, the Haitian Revolution to the end of apartheid in South Africa, I mean, the Haitian Revolution was completely bloody. By the end, they were like, Haiti is for black people. They kick out all the white people and so on and so forth. That doesn't happen in South Africa. So that was pretty amazing. People were pretty impressed with that. One of the other things he has to negotiate, one of the really tough challenges is, well, if we want, because this was the idea, Mandela wants to create a society. He doesn't want to go the Haiti route. He doesn't want to like kick out all the white people and make it like a black only country. He wants to have black South Africans and white South Africans being able to live together in peace. But how is that possible if you don't get closure for all the horrors that black South Africans went through? I mean, if you remember, in like World War II, when you think about what it was like, living, under the Nazis, right? And all the violence and all the horrors that were done during the war, that was a huge reason why we had the Nuremberg trials, right? Where we took the Nazis, we held them accountable, they were killed, they were punished, and, it was very freeing. It can kind of get you past that. Like, okay, the bad guys lost and the good guys won, and we've, fixed this. But in South Africa, when it comes to apartheid, there were so many people involved, and there were so many things going on. And in addition to that, like so many white South Africans were completely oblivious because of the censorship and the fact that there wasn't a free press. A lot of white South Africans had no idea what it was like for black South Africans in South Africa. They were, don't get me wrong, I'm sure a big part of it is kind of willful, lack of knowledge, that they don't want to think about it, don't want to worry about it. But nonetheless, that was one of the issues, is there was no way that South Africa was going to be able to move together unless they kind of cleansed themselves. They got the truth out, and people could really talk about things in a real way. And so that led Mandela to create what he called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was led by Bishop Tutu. He was another leader in the anti-apartheid movement. Anyway, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the idea of the commission was, if you came out and set on record what you did during apartheid, you would be pardoned. You would not be held accountable. But the only way you would get that is if you went in front of the commission and freely admitted what you did and were 100% truthful. And in this way, it would kind of share the pain, it would get the truth out, and that everyone can kind of accept one version of history. If you've seen the news today when it comes to the debate and discussion over, like in this country, right, where you have people who like look at these monuments over the Civil War, right? These Confederate monuments. And some people see them as history, and some people see them as shameful, hallmarks of our slavery and, making heroes out of people who are pro-slavery, and other people say, no, it's this, they were there for the lost cause, and so on and so forth. We have two different groups of people within the same society who view something completely different. This Truth and Reconciliation Commission is trying to avoid that, to get the truth out so that we can view history in one way, that the truth of what our history is something that everyone can acknowledge, and that we can come together in unity after that. And to a certain extent, it's successful. Again, you kind of avoid civil war, but of course there were some people. There were some people who felt like it didn't go far enough, that more people needed to be punished. So there's mixed reviews about it, but that was the goal of it. The big thing that he didn't do, and his biggest the biggest criticism often laid out against Mandela is that he's a little too generous to the white South Africans. And although black South Africans have achieved political equality, and social equality, kind of moving towards that, economic inequality is still just horrific. It is horrific in South Africa that the white South Africans still maintain and control the majority of the wealth. And that's really hard to change. I mean, we've struggled with that in this country, is because at the end of the day, if you want to make, this disadvantaged group, if you want to make them equal, that's going to require taking some wealth out of the hands of the whites to give it to the other group. And that's a much tougher thing to do. And so that's something that South Africa is still struggling with. That a lot of black South Africans are really still stuck in just horrific poverty, and they're kind of working towards that, of trying to receive. There hasn't been enough effort made to create, to kind of battle through wealth inequality in that country, the wealth inequality that springs from this policy of apartheid. All right, so I'm going to now talk about Kwame Nkrumah. Again, he uses the policy of nonviolence in Ghana. Ghana had been named Gold Coast during the period of imperialism. It was renamed. And again, the other big thing that he's known for is this idea of Pan-Africanism. The idea of Pan-Africanism is that, again, the history of Africa, right? A lot of African people were, because of slavery, they were forcibly, migrated to, all over the world, right? You find Africans all over the world because of slavery, right? It wasn't their choice. And so the idea is that all African people, especially all the people within the African continent, all should work together to improve the lives of Africa. That all Africans, wherever they be, should work together to promote the success of Africa, and kind of work together for that. So that's the idea of Pan-Africanism. Next thing is Rwanda, specifically the Rwandan genocide. Just horrific. If you have a chance to see Hotel Rwanda, see it. It's an amazing movie. Again, not 100% historically accurate, but it does give you a really good insight to just how terrible this genocide was. Long story short, the Hutus and the Tutsis are two different tribal groups that live in Rwanda. Rwanda had been a colony of the Belgians. The Belgians turned, again, that kind of divide and rule, right? You keep these tribal groups fighting each other so they won't work together to throw off the imperialists. Anyway, the Hutus and Tutsis do not get along. After Rwanda achieves independence, this resentment, this hatred of the Hutus and the Tutsis kind of explodes. I'm not going to get into detail. You can look it up if you want more details about the events that led into it. Suffice to say, the Hutu majority ended up just murdering the Tutsi minority. Again, mass rapes, murders, so on. This is like people going through the streets with machetes and killing people. And the big horror of this was that the United Nations knew about this genocide and did nothing to stop it. Even though, if you remember, in the wake of the Holocaust, supposedly the UN, one of its missions was to prevent genocide, and it does not. It failed in that mission with Rwanda and with many countries after that. Anyway, let's move on to Egypt. Egypt is another country in Africa. I know it's also sometimes considered the Middle East, but I'm going to just talk about it now. Egyptian nationalism kind of rises again. Egypt was basically, I mean, really more of like economic imperialism from Britain, where it had taken out a lot of loans from the Europeans to have like build dams and irrigation projects, things like that. And what happens is it can't pay back the loans. And so as part of that, it ended up losing control of the Suez Canal. And what Nasser decides to do is Nasser is kind of recognized as like the father of modern Egypt or what have you. And he decides that he is going to nationalize the Suez Canal. What does that mean? He's going to take the Suez Canal and he's going to take it back from the British investors that owned it, that got control of it, and he's going to take it back for Egypt. Long story short, yeah, there was some war over it. They lost, but then they were forced to give it back. So long story short, today, the Suez Canal is now under Egyptian control. Again, Camp David Accord, that's the picture on the left. As you can see, Anwar Sadat, he's the leader who comes to Egypt after Nasser. He is the first Middle Eastern leader to meet with a leader of Israel. He's the first Middle Eastern leader to meet with Israel and to try to settle their differences and reach a peaceful accord. That was the Camp David Accord. Doesn't work out too well for Anwar Sadat. He's assassinated after that. And then the last thing you need to know is that Egypt was involved in the Arab Spring movement, which was basically a wave of democratic movements across the Middle East, but does not end that well. I'll talk about it in a later video, but yeah, there was hope that this would lead to democracy across the Middle East. And actually, in the majority of countries, except one, the end result has been either civil war or a loss of civil liberties for the people. Okay, with that, I'm going to give myself a short break, and then we are going to continue in the next video with the rest of post-colonial independence.